After more than 4.5 years of war on almost every front, the end where I would have least wanted, the Russian front. Since the Allied landing in Normandy, we had all known that the end was coming. We hoped, however, that if we were to be captured, it would be by the Western Allies, among whom we could take for granted respect for the Geneva Conventions. Goebbels's propaganda about subhumans and rumours of atrocities by Russian soldiers now made us fear the worst, along with what we knew of what the SS had done in the USSR. What does a soldier feel when he is taken prisoner? First of all, that for him the war, and the danger of being wounded or even killed, is over. He then asks himself some worrisome questions. Where will he be going? How will they treat him? Will they torture him or even shoot him? He tries to master his rising fear and show courage, and he is concerned at first to suppress any thoughts about the implications of the lost war, or about his personal fate in the coming months or even years. At this decisive moment in my military life, all that mattered to me personally was to show no fear, and hence weakness, but to maintain in this heavy hour my bearing and self-respect, a bearing which we had so often admired in the past years among Allied prisoners. So there we stood with our hands up. From all sides the Russians came at us with their Tommy guns at the ready. I saw to my dismay that they were Mongolians, whose slit eyes revealed hatred, curiosity, and greed. As they tried to snatch away my watch and Knight's Cross, a young officer suddenly intervened. "Stop, don't touch him. He's a guerre, hero, a man to respect." I looked at him and just said, "Spasivo, thank you," surprised at this unexpected reaction. This correct young Russian officer took us at once to the nearest regimental command post, where he handed us over to a colonel of the Tank Corps. My adjutant and dispatch rider were separated from me, and I was taken to a farmhouse. The colonel was agreeably impressed that with my slight knowledge of Russian I was able to answer his questions. "I see that you are like me, a polkovnik, a colonel. What unit do you belong to? Where have you been fighting in the past weeks?" It turned out before long that it had been his tank regiment on which we had inflicted such heavy losses at Lorben. This burly man, who made such a brutal first impression, slapped his thigh and laughed. "You see," he cried, "that's poetic justice. You shot up my tanks and forced us to retreat. Now in recompense I have you as my prisoner." He fetched 2 glasses, and in Russian style filled them to the brim with vodka, so that together we would drain them with one swallow. When I asked where my adjutant and dispatch rider had been taken, I received what was for me a very surprising answer. "They are both with my people of the same rank," he said. "You know, in the Russian army we have 4 categories: generals and colonels, the staff officers, field officers and lieutenants, and other ranks. So don't you worry about it." There were also, incidentally, corresponding differences in their food rations. It passed through my mind that this division was hardly compatible with the idea of communism. These social differences were quite unknown in the German army. In the middle of our conversation, we suddenly heard a wild burst of firing. The colonel jumped up and said, "Give me your word that you will not leave this room till I come back. I rely on you." And he rushed out. I looked through the window and saw that elements of my own tank reconnaissance section of our division were advancing from the wood opposite, another attempt to break out, so it seemed to me. I saw the Russian colonel draw his pistol and run toward his tanks. He drove them forward with threats from his pistol and loud cries, with the result that the attempted breakout was foiled. He came back cursing. "These sons of whores are still afraid of you." In the night that followed, I remained with the colonel, guarded by a tired soldier, to whom I passed on one of the papyrossi cigarettes the colonel had given me. My thoughts took shape. The conduct of the young lieutenant and the colonel scarcely fitted into the image of the Russians that we had formed for ourselves. Certainly the atrocities of the masses that had invaded Germany were indisputable, and exceeded all that could be imagined. But then what had been inflicted on the Russians in huge losses, also among the civilian population, in the treatment of Russian prisoners in Germany and in the devastation of the areas conquered by US, had with reason given rise to immense hatred, which had been further inflamed by Russian propaganda and was now venting itself. In personal encounters, however, as in my own case, it appeared that soldiers all over the world have one thing in common. They have chosen their profession or been called upon to defend their homeland. They respect their opponents, who are doing no more than they themselves, namely their duty. Wars are begun by politicians. They are the true militarists. The conduct of the Russian officers gave some hope for the time that lay ahead. In spite of all the misfortunes that all of us were to endure in the following years, I was still to meet, time and again, officers and many ordinary soldiers who behaved like the colonel, especially as the effects of the propaganda began to subside with the ending of the war. The next morning, the Russian colonel came to tell me, without vodka thank goodness, that he now had to send me to a collecting camp. He gave me his hand in farewell and passed me over to one of his men. We set out on a 3-day march. New prisoners constantly joined our ever-growing column. We were guarded by Russian soldiers of a special unit assigned to the task. At night, we were usually quartered in deserted villages, close together so that we could be guarded better. On the second day, we marched through wooded country that seemed to me ideal for escape. We were only about 30 kilometers from the Elbe, where we supposed the British and the Americans to be. Unfortunately, on that day, because of my rank and knowledge of Russian, I was appointed German commandant of the prisoners, and now had always to march at the head of the column with the Russian commander. Once or twice I managed to distract our guards, so that about a dozen prisoners succeeded in escaping into the woods, and we hoped in reaching the Elbe. I did not know, unfortunately, that the number of prisoners to be delivered had been precisely determined. When it turned out at our next stop that a few were missing, the guards threatened to shoot me if further prisoners were to escape. But what was worse, they fetched civilians at random from the nearby villages to make up the number. These now had to share our fate. I told the column about this, so that no further attempts at escape would be made. The physical condition of some of the prisoners began to cause concern. I eventually persuaded the Russian commander to requisition 2 horse-drawn carts, on which the weakest were allowed to continue the march. After a few days, we reached Hoyerswerda, near Dresden. This was the site of one of the collecting camps, which was very overcrowded with about 10,000 prisoners. Again, I was appointed commandant and had the task of maintaining contact with the Russian commander and maintaining discipline and order in the camp, which in view of the wretched state of the prisoners was not easy. Many tried to resist my instructions with remarks such as, "No more orders, we're all equal now. Officers no longer have any say." While the bulk of the frontline soldiers behaved in exemplary fashion, ugly scenes arose with others who had taken part in the war, not in the front, but in service behind the lines. It was harder for these men to come to terms with the new conditions. Here, too, the preeminent problem was the everyday one, not the fate that lay before us. Provisioning was catastrophic. It consisted essentially of a thin soup, cooked from unhusked oats or fish meal, which was normally used for pig swill. In addition, there were 300 grams of bread. I often had to go with a Russian officer to nearby depots and villages to procure rations for the following days. On one of these journeys, I saw some sacks of raw coffee standing in the corner of a warehouse. I suggested to the Russian officer that we should take some of these green beans along as well, to which he raised no objection. So I had several sacks of Columbia coffee loaded up and brought back to the camp. When we arrived there, the Russian officer wanted to try the beans himself. When they failed to soften after lengthily boiling in water, he said, "You Germans know Kultura. You eat funny hard beans." In this way, I secured the beans for ourselves and told the German camp cook to brew a cup of pure coffee for the whole camp on the following Sunday. The pleasure of the inmates can be imagined. After a few days, we discovered that transports had begun to be assembled for our removal to Russia. The Russian camp doctor, a good-natured elderly man for whom everything revolved around alcohol, told me that only healthy prisoners fit for work would be taken to Russia. There were 4 categories, of which Category 4 meant unfit for work. All the prisoners now had to present themselves to the Russian camp doctor and his assistants for examination, and all those classified as Category 4 were sent home. In the course of this, I managed to get a few very young men who had been thrown into the final battle at the age of 15, even with anti-tank weapons, as well as some people of my own unit into Category 4 by using a simple trick. I made them run around the block 4 times and do some knee bends before they had to report for examination. Then, when the doctor listened to them, he found a rapid or irregular heartbeat and graded them in Category 4. From the stock of one of the medical stores, I managed to scrounge a bottle of pure ether, which the doctor received from me for looking after us. We naturally tried to give those who were being released some sign of life for our relations at home. Since written communications were not allowed and contraventions were liable to severe penalties, the only chance was for those who were going home to learn the addresses by heart. My sign of life never arrived, so neither my mother nor Dagmar nor my friends knew whether I was still alive. Almost every day transports left for the east and the camp began to empty. Last to be assembled was a transport of officers, of which I too formed a part. Up to 60 men were loaded into barred cattle trucks. To the right and left, 2-tiered wooden bunks had been fitted, so that not everyone could sleep at the same time. In the middle of the compartment was a hole for calls of nature. Little slits provided some illumination, but one could not see out of them. The doors were closed tight and were only opened a crack 3 times a day, for our watery soup to be passed in. We were left entirely to ourselves. The guards, mostly unfriendly and unapproachable, stood by the truck with Tommy guns at the ready the moment the train came to a halt. Even under these conditions, they were obviously still afraid of escape attempts. In fact, only one single person managed to get away, through the toilet hole during a stop. Whether he ever reached home, I would venture to doubt. Control over the vast empire was too perfect, and the danger of denunciation too great. Days and weeks went by. Even the destination of our journey was kept from us. We went on further and further to the east. At one of the stops, when we heard the word Brest-Litovsk, we knew that we had arrived at the frontier between Poland and Russia. Here we changed into Russian 18-ton wagons, each loaded with 48 men. Here again, many diseased were sorted out and left behind. Suddenly we heard German voices. "Kameraden, we're on our way home. We were taken prisoner at Stalingrad and come from a camp in Siberia. Throw out slips of paper with your addresses. We'll tell your families." Before we could do so, the guards had chased our friendly helpers away, and on went the journey. We were, in fact, still unaware of the extent of what was in store for us. The situation was too new. We tried to organize ourselves as well as we could. Many tried to keep fit with exercises, while others lay apathetically on their bunks. Because of my rank on the one hand, but especially because of my knowledge of Russian, I was appointed leader. To relieve the monotony, at least for a while, each of us related something of his life. One of our number was my later friend Harold Halley Mom, a well-known German equestrian and derby winner. Because of his defeatist remarks about Hitler, he had been demoted from colonel to lieutenant and transferred to the notorious Dirlewanger Brigade. He told of his encounters with prominent people from Hitler's entourage. The longer the journey lasted, we had been travelling for more than 4 weeks, the more accustomed we became, of necessity, to the ever-repeated daily routine. It was inevitable that discussions arose about why the war was bound to be lost. Some, mainly the older ones among us, saw Hitler as the guilty party, who by his assault on Poland, and encouraged by his blitzkriegs in Poland and France, thought he had first to conquer Russia, so that he could then dictate his terms to Britain. The incapacity of the German generals for not having put him in his place was condemned. It was felt that Hitler had shamelessly exploited our loyalty to the oath. Others, mostly younger ones, could not or would not grasp that National Socialism was played out. They saw the loss of the war more in our material inferiority, and even put some of the blame on the German generals, who had failed to support Hitler's ideas and had even stabbed him in the back with the assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944. The longer their captivity lasted, the more they too came to recognize the fatal consequences for Germany of the so-called Third Reich. No one, however, disputed that the German soldier had fought bravely and had tried, even in a hopeless situation, to defend his home and family. This consciousness determined the behavior of the so-called ordinary frontline soldier, even in captivity in the years that followed, and earned the respect of the Russian guards and officers. Already on the transport we had our first deaths from malnutrition or resignation. We had to witness the bodies being thrown out of the truck by the guards the next time the train stopped. No one will ever find their graves. Day after day we travelled through endless steppes, and it was only during the short stops for the issue of food that we could tell from the position of the sun that we were travelling in a southeasterly direction, hence not towards Siberia. Suddenly, after nearly 5 weeks of travel, during which we had never left the truck, came a longer stop. According to those who knew the area, who had fought there, we must have been in the vicinity of the Crimea or the Sea of Azov. Truck by truck we were taken to a delousing station. The Russians had a mortal fear of epidemics, so not only the prisoners but even the Russian soldiers were shorn to the scalp, and the houses were periodically disinfected and whitewashed on the outside. The delousing was certainly an unpleasant procedure, but a welcome break in the monotonous journey. Our clothing and the few possessions that remained to us after all the frisking went into a separate room, while we had to go naked through the delousing. It was like a gift from heaven to be able finally to soap oneself. At the end of the procedure, we had to search out our clothes from a huge pile of rags. During the whole procedure, our trucks and the delousing buildings were surrounded by Russian soldiers with Tommy guns, and we could see from their faces that they were obviously still afraid of us. That was for us, and probably still is today, a remarkable fact. More than 1,000 emaciated prisoners of war, for whom any attempt at escape would have amounted to suicide, still seemed to the Russians to be a potential danger. Fear, especially of the Germans, is deep-rooted among the Russians and runs through all social classes, as I was to find confirmed indeed time and again in the following years of captivity. Every attempt to relieve them of this fear was to no avail. Back to the truck. The journey continued. The short break had done us good. It was October. The temperature slowly rose. Clearly we had already come a long way south. We were tormented by thirst, but the water ration remained as small as it had ever been. We were climbing? The air became thinner. We appeared to be crossing the Elbrus Mountains. Behind them lay the Caucasus. Finally, after exactly 35 days of travel by rail in a closed truck, we were at our destination, a small town on the southern slopes of the Elbrus. Our journey lasted from the 15th of September until the end of October, 35 endless days. Only twice did we leave our wagons, in Rostawi for delousing and in Kutaisi for climbing coal transport wagons, each with 100 standing men, in order to reach Tikibuli, the local town, as it was called. The mountains of the Caucasus, which means snow-covered, separate the North Caucasus from the South Caucasian tropical lowlands. The Elbrus, at 5,629 metres, 18,481 feet, is the highest peak. Along its southern edge runs the ancient military and trade route to Persia and Turkey. To the south, the valley, 1,300 kilometres long, is closed by the mountains that rise toward Turkey and Persia. Ararat is the highest peak. The southern Caucasians, Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis, were regarded even in antiquity as freedom-loving peoples. Prometheus is supposed to have been chained to a rock here, and Jason to have searched for the Golden Fleece. By the 4th century AD, Christianity had become the state religion. In about the year 800, Islam began to spread. Under David II in the 12th century, the Kingdom of Georgia experienced its highest flowering. He made Tiflis, Tbilisi, the capital city. His successor, Queen Tamara, is still revered today. Later, Georgia was occupied by the Mongolians. Under pressure from the Turks and Persians, the kingdom collapsed in the 15th century. Protection was sought in the north. The Russians all too gladly concluded a treaty of friendship with the Georgians. Catherine II could realize Russia's old dream of opening a way to India. In 1801, Alexander, treaty of friendship or not, incorporated Georgia into the Russian Empire. Russian became the official language. An uprising of the Caucasian peoples was suppressed with much bloodshed in 1860. Many withdrew into the inhospitable mountains. After the October Revolution in 1917, the Caucasus was Bolshevized, again after heavy fighting, and incorporated into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Today I cannot help thinking of the comparison with Afghanistan, where a freedom-loving people want to spare themselves a similar fate. Because of its tropical climate, the southern Caucasus was regarded even in Tsarist times as a favorite spa or holiday resort, which it still is today. Pushkin, Lermontov, and Tolstoy all lived there at one time or another, and described the paradise and the freedom struggles of the Caucasian peoples. Alexander Dumas dedicates his book Caucasian Journey to these peoples. The atmosphere is very oriental. In contrast to Russian women, who all look the same in their padded jackets and who frequently do heavy men's work, the thoroughbred girls of the Caucasus, often very beautiful, take great delight in pretty clothes. Many of the men, we noticed, had a long nail on the little finger of the left hand, a sign that they did no physical work, we were told. All tropical fruits grow in the lowlands, and most Russian tea is also grown in this region. The slopes of the Elbrus Mountains are the source of highly prized timber. The delicious wild strawberries are not even picked. After the opera houses of Moscow and Leningrad, that of Tiflis takes third place. In spite of all its troubles, the Caucasus enjoyed an economic boom at the beginning of the 20th century, through the opening up of the oil deposits on the Caspian Sea and the great coal and mineral mines in the area of Tikibuli. This prosperity more or less disappeared under the Bolshevik regime. During the First World War, the Georgians made one last attempt to win back their independence. They placed their territory under Germany as a protectorate. With the help of Germany's ally Turkey, the German general von Kress managed to gain the sympathy of the Georgians, which we prisoners of war came to feel even 30 years later. In 1918, after Germany had lost the war, the British took over the Georgian protectorate, mainly to prevent Russia from extending her sphere of influence too far to the south, thereby threatening the dominion of India. They even forced Russia, weakened by the disorders of the revolution, to recognize the independence of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. It was not until 1921 that the Russians marched into the southern Caucasus again, and this time stayed for good. The tragedy of history would have it that it was a Georgian, Joseph Stalin, who made it possible for the Caucasian peoples to be finally incorporated into the Russian Empire. Stalin was at the time People's Commissar for National Questions in Moscow, and thus shared responsibility for the fate of his own people. Even in 1947 there were Georgians working with us in the coal mines who in 1936 had tried for the last time to shake off Russian rule. Today the KGB, through an ingenious system of spies and informers, knows how to suppress all opposition. So our few attempts at escape, which were supported by Georgians, also came to naught. Of the beauty of Georgia, we Germans, about 1,500 emaciated officers in closed trucks, saw nothing as our train rolled slowly through Kutaisi, a provincial city in the valley, and then climbed the mountains to reach Tikibuli at a height of 1,500 meters, the destination of our 35-day journey. This little town exists from the mining of the vast deposits of bituminous coal. Around it, camps had been set up in which Russian convicts and prisoners of war were quartered as workforce. Our Camp 518, later 7,518, consisted of 6 camps, with the main Camp 518/1 and Camp 518 halves in Tikibuli. Besides the German Camp 518, which consisted of Tikibuli and one near Kutaisi, there was another camp in our area for Hungarians, and a further camp for Japanese prisoners. In addition to these, one of the notorious Sakluchoni camps, which is as much as to say the enclosed, was in the area. Here criminals and political opponents lived under the severest conditions, without knowing whether they would ever regain their freedom. The most astonishing thing to us were the camps containing Russian soldiers, who had marched into Germany with the Russian army, and were now supposed to forget in 2 years in camps all that they had seen of Western decadence in capitalist Germany. In return for having helped to achieve victory, these men were now locked up for 2 years before they were allowed to go home. All Russian soldiers who had become prisoners were punished by staying in special camps. In main camp 518, there were 1,500 of us officers and some 2,000 rank-and-file soldiers, who received us with curiosity and suspicion, and shouts of, "It's all up now with giving orders," and "Now show us if you're as good at being plenis," the Russian word for prisoners, "as you were at being officers." This did not sound very encouraging. Our common fate and the will to get the better of the situation permitted us in the course of time to grow together into a community. The camp was about as primitive as one can imagine a camp in Russia to be. It was surrounded by a high fence. At each corner stood a watchtower, from which searchlights at night cast a bright glare over the neighborhood. Their heavily armed Russian guards performed their watch. 3 wooden barracks with some 40 to 60 men per room provided quarters for us 3,500 prisoners of war. Two-tiered wooden bunks with thin straw mattresses, a table and a few chairs were the only furniture. A simple iron stove for the cold winter months in the high mountains, nevertheless did give us good service. Further parts of the camp were a kitchen barrack, a room for drying our clothes, a delousing barrack, and a latrine with wooden beams, where about 60 men could relieve themselves, semi-exposed to the elements. Additionally, there was a hospital barrack and a kind of dining room used for all kinds of performance. Outside the camp compound was a barrack for the guards, and a further barrack for the Russian commanders and the camp administration. The very next morning we were greeted with, "My name is Jupp Link." He was the German camp commandant, a wiry young man of 25 who was responsible for order in the camp and for liaison with the Russian commandant. He said that everyone there had to work, even the colonels. Moscow was far away, the Geneva Conventions were unknown here. Those who were unsuitable for outside work had to do camp work. Jupp Link, a German non-commissioned officer as commandant? Was he to be trusted? What part did he play with the Russians? As was very soon to appear, we all had a lot for which to thank him. Born as a so-called Danubian-Swabian German in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, modern Yugoslavia, he spoke Serbo-Croatian, Hungarian and Russian fluently, and was suitable therefore as a go-between with the Russians. Here again the typical Russian tactic appeared, namely of keeping themselves in the background and letting others solve the problems. Jupp Link had come to Tikibuli some months before us, and had helped to construct the 6,518 camps. The men in the upper main camp 518-1, about 2,000 of them, had been going to work ever since their arrival as pit brigades, or as brigades for outside duty. Specialists were sorted out and employed in the camp as mechanics, radio experts, cobblers, tailors, etc., or were sent down the mine as mechanics. Since the Russians lacked qualified craftsmen, and since those there were did their work in a slovenly way, our specialists had to work in place of the Russians. I remember an amusing story which the German watchmaker told. One day a Russian guard turned up in his workshop with an alarm clock that he had brought back from Germany with the request, "This clock too big. You make me 2 watches from it for wrist." When the watchmaker tried to tell him that this was impossible, he grew angry and threatened him, saying, "You sabotage, you Nazi swine." It took help from Jupp Link to calm him down. In the days that followed, Jupp Link enlightened us about the work structure. All prisoners are hired by the State Mining Authority, which is responsible for all work in the locality. For this, a certain sum per head and hour of work has to be paid to the camp commandant. From these receipts, the Russian commandant has to defray all the expenses of the camp, for provisions, clothing, and the maintenance of the accommodation. Every prisoner has a wage sheet kept for him. From the balance left over, each is supposed to receive monthly pocket money. The remainder of the money is credited to him until such time as he may be released. That was the theory. In practice, things were rather different. Considerable sums were privately diverted by the Russian commandant for himself and 1 or 2 familiars. I know of no case in which anyone received pocket money or a look at his account. The best example was our fellow prisoner Erlschläger, a communist of long standing who had been in a German concentration camp to begin with, and had then got into the notorious Dirlewanger Brigade on probationary frontline service. Although this was known to the Russians, he worked for years on end as a welder down the mine, and the only privilege he received was a double portion of watery soup per day. In 1949, when the first prisoners were released and Erlschläger was assigned to a transport home, he tried to get the camp administration to pay him the credit balance for which he had worked. He was told that the transport officer had his money. Rubles could not be taken into Germany, so his money would be exchanged at the frontier with East Germany. He never saw a kopeck of it, and disappointed as he was, had himself discharged, not in his old homeland in East Germany, but in the West. "I'm fed up with all that I have seen and been through," he wrote on a postcard that reached us. "This isn't the communism for which I went to a concentration camp." Some fellow prisoners, however, received a small sum credited to them. The next morning we all had to fall in on the parade ground to be detailed for work. The Russian commandant, an army officer, accompanied by the NKVD officer, now the KGB, appeared with Jupp Link. In a loud voice and with much gesticulation, the commandant told us that we now had to atone for Hitler's misdeeds and work off all that we had done to the Russian people. He then gave the order, "Everyone to the doctor now, the strongest down the mine, others for road building, everyone is to work, davai, hurry up." The Russian camp doctor was Dr. Holländer, who was assisted by his wife. Both were Jews, and for understandable reasons not well disposed toward us. Not only had they to make the sick fit for work again as soon as possible, but they were also responsible for the delousing and disinfection of the barracks. Dr. Holländer's standard remark was, "If not clean, you wipe with caps, must all be solid white." We understood his Yiddish, and also that he was not to be trifled with. After the examination, the detailing began. For those of us who had to go down the mine, the simplest clothing was issued. Shifts were formed, one for the morning, the afternoon, and the night. We were away from the camp for 12 hours altogether, 8 hours down the mine and a further 4 hours taken up by the march out and back. If we came back tired and with clothes wet through, the thin soup was quickly slurped up, and then it was on the bunks to sleep. To my great surprise, one day I was appointed German camp commandant. Jupp Link became inspector of work. The Russian commandant even insisted that I wear my insignia of rank and my Knight's Cross as signs of my dignity. I received a propusk, an exit permit, which entitled me to leave the camp, alone and without supervision, up to 10 o'clock at night. Among my duties I had also to maintain contact, in collaboration with Jupp Link, with the Overnachelnik, the head of the coal mines, and the most powerful man in the town. It was with him and his officials that the work norms had to be negotiated. Here, too, for the most part, the Russian camp administration kept out of things. When this great man heard that I had fought in Russia in 1941 as a German colonel, he asked me one day, "Where were you in action? With what division?" "In the middle sector, with the 7th Panzer Division, via Smolensk and Vyazma to Klin and Yakroma, north of Moscow." "Tell me about Yakroma," he went on. "Exactly when were you there?" I was surprised by his interest, but told him, "In December 1941, I advanced with my tank reconnaissance section via Klin to the Moscow-Volga Canal, and was able to cross it, the first unit to do so, at Yakroma, about 30 to 40 kilometers north of Moscow. I can well remember how we went into a little Russian inn to get warm. On the table stood the steaming samovar and an almost untouched breakfast, which we ate up with a good appetite. I was interrupted by his roar of laughter. "That was my breakfast. I was a colonel in the reserve, and during your surprise attack I had to leave Yakroma and my breakfast rather abruptly. So small is the world, Polkovnik. Now you are here as a prisoner of war, and I am the boss of this town, in which I found myself at the end of the war. If you have any requests, I'll try to help you, although your camp commandant is responsible for you, and I have merely engaged you for work." After this meeting, our ways were to cross more often. My activity as German camp commandant was only of short duration. The Russian camp commandants were replaced. The 6 camps in the Tikibuli area were in the province of Colonel Laroche, who came from a Huguenot family that had fled to Russia. With him, however, we had practically no dealings. Our camp 518 came under Guard Captain Samcharadze, a Georgian. His deputy was a Russian colonel. This too is possible in the Russian army. Both were army officers and were watched over by the NKVD, to which the notorious Black Nena also belonged, a politruk who came from Armenia. I was summoned to Samcharadze and asked to specify by name all those in the camp who had been SS officers, members of police units or units that had been employed in partisan warfare. In return, he offered me special rations and other privileges. Beside him stood a NKVD officer who watched me with mistrust. My answer was confined to the words, "I don't know of anyone in the camp who was a member of these military units." Naturally, there were several fellow prisoners whom I knew had been in the SS or the police, and several others of whom I suspected as much. But I took the point of view, and still do today, that every German prisoner of war was to be respected as such. If he had incurred any guilt, he should, after his eventual release, be brought before a German court. In no event, however, was he to be handed over to the Russians. Since I declined to name any names, even after being given time for reflection, I was replaced as commandant. Jupp Link was given the post once more. At the same time, I had to remove all my insignia and orders. Now we were all equal, and that was good. The state of the barracks was wretched. Apart from periodic disinfection, delousing, and the whitewashing of the rooms, nothing was done. We suffered terribly from thousands of bugs, which nested in wooden bunks or dropped down from the ceiling at night. We got hold of some old tin cans from the mine and filled them with scrounged petrol to prevent the bugs from climbing up. Every few weeks we took the bunks outside to burn them off with blow lamps, likewise scrounged, and destroy the hatching bugs. In all the years it remained a hopeless struggle. We suffered most from the rations. The 300 grams of bread per day, which officially was allowed to contain up to 30% water, drove some people to throw their portions angrily against the barrack wall, where the bread then stayed, stuck. The thin soup contained nothing nourishing apart from some millet flour or maize. Bread and watery soup formed the basis of our diet. Sometimes we received all kinds of fish. Fellow prisoner Wynand told me that he used to boil down the fish heads to get a soup, and that he grilled the bones for another meal. There was hardly any fat, no seasoning, no vitamins. As a result, the mortality rate from malnutrition rose rapidly. While the familiar diseases of civilization were virtually absent, almost all the prisoners had retention of fluid in the legs. If this reached the heart, here too death was certain. Further causes of death were the frequently occurring cases of twisting of the intestine through lack of fat. The medical team was helpless. Our German doctors pointed out to the Russian commandants time and again that more workers would perish if the diet was not improved. But since the rations were fixed by Moscow, there was nothing to be done. On the contrary, we were cursed all the more because our imperialist war had made the food situation in Russia so bad. A further disease of frequent occurrence was the infectious paratyphoid fever. Since it usually ended in death, the Russians were very anxious about the danger of infection, and for this reason set up a closely guarded isolation ward. One night, Graf Hohenlohe, a young lieutenant, appeared by my bunk. He had been in the isolation ward with paratyphoid, and in his delirium had walked out of the hospital barrack. The guard had obviously been asleep. We at once alerted the Russian doctor, as we were terribly afraid of infection. Hohenlohe died 2 days later. None of us will forget the sight of the dead from the sick wards being piled onto old carts each morning and drawn out of the camp by emaciated prisoners of war, then to be hurriedly interred. We were not allowed to bury them and furnish their graves with crosses and names. Despite the fact that it was forbidden, we wrote their names on scraps of paper, but these were then taken away from us again during the regular searches. So we arranged that each person would make a mental note of 1 or 2 names, so that if he should go home, relatives could be informed. In the first 2 years, especially in the severe winters in the Elbrus Mountains, about 50% of the prisoners of war died. To be fair, it should be said that even the Russians, in the years 1945 and 1946, were not much better off than we as far as food was concerned. Many of them, however, had the chance of procuring something at the little market, where peasant women from the vicinity sold maize, eggs, and millet cakes. After 2 years, we who had been spared by diseases and had not yet abandoned hope of going home, had become acclimatized. Hunger indeed remained, but so astonishingly did our strength. There was a German dentist in the camp who was supervised by Dr. Hollander. His only equipment was a hand-driven drill. There were also no anesthetics, so when necessary diseased teeth were extracted without any. Worst of all were the military guards, who examined us for gold crowns, and when they found any, broke them off with a pair of pincers without our being able to resist, so as to sell them later and thus supplement their miserable pay. For me personally, the result was that when I returned home I had to have my lower jaw chiselled out, as it was full of pus and the roots of the teeth had rotted. One other peculiarity struck us. Moscow had ordained that officers, in addition to the bread ration and the watery soup, which were the same for everyone, were to receive 20 grams of butter and a little sugar every day. Via Juplink, we requested the Russian commandant to treat us exactly like the rest of the men. With a reference to the Moscow regulations, this was rejected out of hand. Juplink collected 400 signatures from among the officers, and finally succeeded in getting the special rations distributed equally to the whole camp, in the way we were accustomed to in the armed forces. I was replaced then as German commandant and assigned to work in the pits. In the circumstances, I felt fit and was glad in some ways not to be in an exposed position anymore, caught between two sides, as it were, where it was a question of helping my many fellow prisoners and at the same time of keeping the Russian camp administration happy. I can understand better today how difficult the task must have been for young Jup Link and how grateful we should all be for his efforts. The main pit in which I worked had what was for European miners an incredible seam, which in parts was up to 15 meters thick. Rich bituminous coal, gleaming bright, was mined on a kind of chamber system. We worked alongside Russians and Georgians, who proved to be good mates, and often shared their last bit of bread with us. The authorities had forgotten to take away my propusk, so I could leave the camp at any time. The guards, who meanwhile knew me well, often asked me to get them something from the market, and for this pressed their kopecks trustingly into my hand. As in every enterprise in Russia, a norm was fixed for the extraction of coal, which everyone had to fulfill each day. Although we were in poor physical shape, our mine workers in the early days worked at fulfilling the quota with German thoroughness and application. One day, one of the brigades exceeded the norm. The Russians pounced on them at once. "Are you mad?" they cried. "As soon as the norm is exceeded even once, it is immediately raised for everyone the next day, and in spite of that we don't get 1 kopeck or 1 gram of bread extra. Fulfill the norm and that's it." It was a lesson to us. On the other hand, I have seen some Russians, usually Sakluchonis, in protest against their bad treatment, not fulfill the norm or down tools for a while. To this, the reaction of the management was as simple as it was effective. For transport reasons, there would be no bread for a few days, and the norm was soon fulfilled again. In the pits, hard coal was mined to a depth of up to 15 meters. Safety measures in the pits were virtually unknown. On the one hand, the management, centrally controlled from Moscow, could not get the necessary articles such as protective helmets, etc., diverted to the Caucasus, and on the other, it was for them merely a matter of criminals and prisoners of war, among whom one more or less was not of great consequence. In place of protective helmets, we wore primitive caps. The mined areas were scantily supported. I am still astonished today at how few serious accidents occurred. In the cold winter months, we had to see to the heating of our barracks ourselves. The Russian commandant was in fact liable for this too, but since there was enough coal in the pits, he spared himself the expense. The mine administration strictly forbade the taking out of coal, but after every shift, the mine workers had fair-sized lumps of the rich mineral under their arms, which they carted back to the camp. There it was distributed equally between all the rooms. Thus, the right hand did not know what the left was doing. At the start of 1946, after only a few months down the mine, I was suddenly taken out and transferred to a road construction brigade. I do not know to this day whom I had to thank for this transfer, Jup Link or the overnachalnik, my breakfast colonel, from Yakroma. Another chapter of my captivity began.